We are obviously all very tired, but that is the last chance when you can ask questions or formulate your comments during this event. So if you feel like saying something more general or coming to some issues raised during these 2 days, please.
Let me just register an area of dismay. After 2 days of rewarding, but at the same time, exhausting exploration, we find ourselves, I think, at the very place where we began. And that is with this frustration that we haven't overcome some of the fundamental challenges. We still use the same categories. But most of all, I think that it's a failure of terminology. What we've been doing is invoking the same terminology that has been around for decades. And as a result, we're never going to break free from these categorical imperatives until we articulate a whole new system, let's say not of values, but of descriptive terms, of critical vocabulary. And let me be a little bit more specific in why I'm somewhat discomfited by the 2 days of debate. And that is, we're looking for a type of voice for Central Europe. And the problematic is that the voice has always been imposed from outside, either as a type of colonialism or as a failure of the region itself to articulate its own voice. And I think this failure, this silence, is a result of an inability to articulate a vocabulary of critical terms independent of that which is inherited or seized upon from the West. Now, this was not true at the beginning of the 20th century. If one looks at so much of the terminology, it originated not in the West, but in Central Europe. Barbaro genius. I mean, one could cite one term after the other. And therefore, the fount of, let's call it, art historical engagement originated in this district. And there was no sense of periphery and center. In fact, one could say the center was Central Europe in terms of intellectual engagement and productivity. It's only after the war, and whether it's the result of one cause or another, the point is, even today, and so many of the papers that were eloquent in so many important respects still invoke the same terminology and critical terms that had been used by, let's call it, the dominant cultures that still tend to prevail. It's less a problem of language, let's say the dominance of English, because one could say that before the war there was a dominance of German or French or even Italian. But the problem, in my view, is the failure of Central Europe, East Central Europe, to articulate its own voice. And that voice can only rise when one seizes for itself, if I can be so bold as an American, but ourselves as those committed to the understanding and promotion of Central Europe, our own voice. Otherwise, we remain silent. We remain so dependent on the critical vocabulary that dominates elsewhere. And in a sense, we have colonized ourselves by embracing uncritically that terminology. And I know, of course, that in the 60s, 70s, and particularly in the 80s, artists in particular tried to come up with their own vocabulary, the anti-this or the counter-this. But this was all given up, all surrendered. It didn't take traction. And I was hopeful that one of the things one would hear, and perhaps one will hear the next gathering, that either from South Africa or elsewhere, we'll get a new critical vocabulary that will free us from the reliance, one might say all too exclusively, on the dominant or dominance of, let's call it, West Euro-American tradition. That's all.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steven, for this wonderful summary. And, Marina.
Thank you. I actually have to respond. I thought the silence is just the first moment because the organizers simply to give them a possibility to conclude the conferences. This is how I thought it is because we are coming to the end. We said, and we are not hegemonic, that we immediately recuperate, like in old Western style, everything what was said. The big authorities stand and say A, B, C, D, E, G, nothing is okay. So I thought because of this, it's not necessary to recuperate because it was very alive. And I just want to, but I don't want to leave the space with this patronizing, hegemonic discourse that stay on us like we are not capable of nothing, everything is repeated. No, the world changed, the notions change. They are maybe the same notions, but they are absolutely put in a different context. And the dominant discourse wants also not only to dominate, but wants to see how means to free. So to enjoy in this, and we will not give this enjoyment to the dominant discourse because we don't need to free ourselves because we actually work and do and think. So this is my point.
Yes, I wanted to actually second to what Stephen said, very much repeating what I said, for example, in Lublin, but also in other places. And there are two things. One is that, yes, there is a contradiction between claiming that we have a very specific East European or East Central European art and the fact that we describe that art with the terminology of the Western and the Russian artistic terms. And this is, I think, really a problem. And the latest example for that is when there was a very good Hungarian discovery of a certain artistic group and artistic activity in the 1910s that our art historians hurried to label Hungarian fauves. And they were not fauves, they were something. They were something quite specifically Hungarian, but we don't have the word for that. And what I suggested, and I keep on suggesting, is that this is not the task of one person to come up with a terminology. This is our collective task. So we really have to find, if we claim that we are having something very specific, Eastern or East Central European, we do have to find a terminology for that. And the other thing that I wanted to say is to confirm that idea that, again, was said in, I also repeat myself, that the local narratives have to be established and very firmly and much more in details because we can't have an actual global discourse without having very strong local narratives. So this is all.
What animated my remarks was not disappointment necessarily, but frankly, what one hopes to do is to improve, let's call it Western art or the Western perception of modernism by not assuming the, let's say, the tasks. You leave, or one leaves, the dominant posture unchallenged. And I think it is at the cost of modern 20th and 21st century art universally not to be enriched by what can derive, as was just said, from local narratives, sensitively penetrated, incisively analyzed, and yielding a vocabulary of dealing with it that could enrich not just here in Central Europe, but could filter and enrich that to the West, to the South, and elsewhere. In other words, there's a global responsibility that could be seized productively here that perhaps will never be, for the reasons intimated in a response a moment ago, or other reasons not yet articulated by those to the West, let's say. Those in the West don't need to do it, but they should, and they're not going to. The only hope is to turn elsewhere And that's the great promise of a global art history or global history, any type of global isms, is that it can challenge the dominant paradigms.
If I may, for me, this comment a little bit resembles on the remark of Katarina David, who told in the documenta that Eastern European art did not contribute to art. So this is somehow resembles me that Eastern Europe does not contribute to theory. So maybe it is not the voice which is missing, but maybe the ear is missing. Couldn't be that the case?
Ear. Oh, maybe I will take a chance to add something that I would like to add that because it was discussion, should we maintain categories or binary categories or not? So I will return to my initial conclusion, although it's complicated, that probably we should maintain those categories, because if we introduce the binary category of a labor and capital, in those terms, Central Eastern Europe, post-communist Europe, post-socialism Europe is still marginalized. So the Western companies are abusing, labor force in our region, and the capital. The flow of capital is global, but still there is something like marginalized regions, and Central Eastern post-communist Europe is marginalized in terms of economy. So if we return with this discussion to the Marxist base, and we literally splash it against the base, then we can see that we can set into the dialectical motion categories of East and West, former East, but we have to introduce, so we have to come back to the future of communism. So we have to introduce again the class division category, the opposition of labor and capital, and those cannot be invalidated so easily, because this is the real dimension, not symbolical. Okay, now I can.
May I would like to say that I think we cannot just dismiss so easily the hegemony of English when we talk about terminology. And I think I have a hypothesis that there is a plenty of the colonial knowledge in the regional languages out there, which is not integrated. And I think this hegemony of English, it is, of course, it has a economical background, but it is something, that influence the way how we use terminology. And also, I have a trivial remark that when I was looking around for existence of Central Europe or Eastern Europe, I look into the study about voting group in Eurovision. It was PhD written about Eurovision contest, and so they are voting groups, and there is a Central Eastern European voting group. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say. So it exists at some point.
Okay, I'm going to do it first. So I spoke about eStart map, and I must say that eStart map was very usually misunderstood as being something against the West. This was not the case at all. We didn't touch the West at all. We just wanted to cover the questions that were opened in front of our threshold, doors. So nothing else was in question. And I must say that what I'm facing these 2 days is fantastic. It was really brilliant, fantastically vivid conference that was possible to follow here. With such brilliant papers, with a series of highly profiled specialists. So it's fantastic. I see for the first time a serious possibility that this work is seriously done. What better to do than this? You have, it's not necessary to enter in the very hard and difficult question of resolving general issues at once, but just to cover the space, just to basically to decide about what is important from this space, but to do it from the point of view which somehow envisions the entire territory, which till now had no forum that was capable to do that. So it's a fantastic possibility which I see.
Okay, one thing we didn't mention and that was said in that conference in 1990 was the Scottish artist, and he said that we in the West are as bad in capitalism as you were in communism, and communism failed badly. Magda hopes it's resurfacing, but what we're witnessing now is capitalism failing badly, and this is another response to what we have, what is going on now. So what we're talking about is what you will reminiscent in the future about the moment when capitalism was falling.
Hi. I want to express the same enthusiasm as come from the artists in our midst, is that I think there is a great body of scholarship that is forming, and in Piotrowski we had somebody who put some theory out there that is very useful. So I just want to say how much I enjoyed all of the papers, and also how much I enjoyed a little glimpse into how we can put this into our teaching, because so many of us are teachers, and not ever to focus on a hierarchical understanding of art history is probably the first way that we can approach integrating the diaspora, which I also found to be an extremely good word and an excellent concept to use in the future. So what I would like to add is that I come from the Rhode Island School of Design, where we teach artists and future designers, and our introduction to art history is completely ahistorical. It is very much like was introduced by Ellison, and it's very available for all teachers. You can get access to the amazing timeline put together by the Metropolitan Museum of Art called the Heilbronn Chronology, that gives you access to all of the works in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and all of the chronologies that have been established worldwide. So if you're looking for ways to start your teaching according to the Piotrowski way, there is an opening there. Thank you.
Hey, can I? So I just agree with all of you who say how stimulating those 2 days were. This was absolutely an amazing collection of papers, and I think that from all the conferences that I have attended, I don't know, throughout the last 30 years, this was definitely the most invigorating. I kept making notes, and I'm going to pursue some of the ideas that I took from many of your papers. And in that sense, I think it's amazing, and I would even enter into polemics with you that there were some terms which were introduced here, which were coined here, perhaps in response to Piotr Piotrowski peripheries of the word unite. This is a slogan, but this is a very good slogan. We need slogans like that, and then the concept which was difficult to grasp, and we actually discussed that, the minority transnationalism, is it this minor transnationalism? I think that's also very stimulating, and maybe that it has been used by somebody else, but I haven't encountered it so far. Was it? No, you didn't invent it. Oh, it's a pity. I regret it. So anyway, so yes. But of course, I have some questions in my head, my mind, and I mean, I have actually. I think I flagged them in my paper, or perhaps in the discussion, that I think that Eastern Europe is a discourse, isn't it? So the question is, I mean. I'm not sure. I mean, is it is it a discourse? I mean, is there a reality, or is it just a discourse? This is what I worry
Economical
about.
reality.
Is it a reality?
Economical reality? Yeah, I believe so.
Eastern Europe?
Yeah.
It was. And no longer,
It
in my
still
opinion.
is. Yes. I just intended to ask Dorota to speak up because she told me something that I could you repeat what you told me, please.
Well, I can wait.
Thank you. I also enjoyed the conference and very much. And I want to refer to this conflict that emerged, has emerged here between Marina and Stephen. And I think that it will be a big failure if we go back to the East and West division, which threatens all the time, comes back and threatens as a threat that we will step back to the old Interpol conflict, which I think would be a big mistake. And I have a big doubt, like referring to your response, that there is an essence of the Central European or East European subject. So I don't feel this. We, as you mentioned, that we should oppose a hegemony of the West. I don't really understand what we could mean, and I totally agree with Katarzyna, with Kasia, who said that Eastern and Central Europe is rather a discourse than the essence, than the absolute. It doesn't exist as an essence, and I actually don't feel this essence and Central European identities. So I have a deep doubts about if we should retain or keep this, hold this notion, because as Edith said in her paper, it is dangerous because it takes us. Some ideas takes us back to the past instead of designing the future. So that's all. That's my comment. And the comment about the conference is that I don't feel here the Central or Eastern and Western Europe. I felt here like kind of out of the map, off the map. So that's the feeling. I don't know what it means.
I would like just to add before, sorry, but my intention, and not because of nothing else, but because we talk, I just reacted because it was a silence afterwards, and I thought it will be kind of astonishing to leave the space with such conclusive words. And it's not about East and West, it's about a space where we open a discourse and discuss. And after 2 days, to be said that practically the things just is stuck, I thought after all this hearing, all these discussions and opening the thinking, it was necessary to react.
Sorry. I'm just desperately trying to say something, but I can leave you beforehand. So if I just may, I would like to make a very brief remark, pretending that I'm not an Eastern European scholar working on Eastern European stuff. And my remark will come from the field of architectural history. And actually, as Marina just said, there was a lot about space here. We spoke so much about embodied space, political space, politicized space, flattened space, whatever kind of spaces. So my remark, in order to complicate a little bit this discussion on vocabularies and conceptions, would be that in the vocabulary and epistemology of architectural historiography, horizontality, flatness, resistance are terms that were introduced several decades ago. So I was thinking that this is very much like the Mieke bulb traveling concepts. And I'm so curious to see how these concepts will exist in, let's say, 2 decades or 3 decades, because I can tell you that nowadays, these concepts within architectural history, they are not quite what they used to be 40 years ago, for instance, or perhaps more than that.
Can I just add a few words? Okay, to be very brief because we're all tired. Reacting very briefly to Stephen's very provocative set of remarks. First, I think that there's been different types of terminologies that we can take a look at. One set would be the analytical tools that the art historians may mobilize in order to describe practices or to invent methodological terms. And there's been some obvious in many of us, like the synchro thing that I don't remember how Alison framed it very well, but this has been, I tentatively used transversality and you immobilized minor to transnationalism and others. I think your point about the artistic currents, in which terms can they define themselves, is a different question that we have to address. I can see particularly the strategic need to articulate these, because otherwise, of course, as you already showed, there is this wider category such as pop that is sweeping up the word, flattening in a bad sense, because I spoke about flattening, but without equalizing actually spaces and equalizing practices that were not described as such by the artist. In your case, for instance, I've noticed there's Corneliu Brudashku. I know the exhibition, but Brudashku never referred to himself as being pop artist. He's been at the same time in an exhibition in Ludwig Museum labeled as photorealist artist, has given an example of that in different cases, and in interviews with him, he always refers to himself as practicing a kind of realism. So I think that in many other cases we have terminologies, and in Piotrowski's books there are other cases for naming such other distances, but just probably, as Edith has just pointed out rightly, they didn't get enough currency because perhaps we didn't use them as frequently as we should. And the last remark that I would like to make today, I wonder why are we so afraid of leaving some things unnamed? Because I think that there is a potential, a disturbing potentiality into leaving things that are without a name because they are uncontrollable entities. And I think that if we want to master everything, to control everything, we can, and this is back to Marina, we would be trapped in the same homogenizing or hegemonic interest in relation to the capital. We want to control everything, to name everything, and to classify everything. So going back to something that is no longer fashionable, but it was first a critical potential called deconstruction from Derrida. I wonder if some terms cannot be let like floating terms, like practices that ask not to be named, but rather to continue to destabilize the notions that we have received and we work with, like pop, for instance. No, that is all.
So, thank you for a wonderful conference, lots of food for thought. I just want to add a little bit. I do think we need to think about our own subject position and think about the terms we use, as Stephen points out. I also think we need to think about the works that we choose to look at, the works that we're interested in, and to what extent is the emphasis, for example, on performance and installation art affirming a Western perspective when we look at these things. Can we combine that interest, our interests, and possibly that Western interest with the official narratives that were written before '89? And maybe this is different in East Germany than elsewhere, but you know, for East Germany, why are we dismissing the narratives that were written before '89? There was excellent scholarship in East Germany about East German art. Why do we have to dismiss it? Why can't we add to it? And is that dismissal itself a Western perspective? And then something else that came out today in Candace and Katerina's talk, among others, is that we shouldn't always be looking to the West because they weren't always looking to the West, right? They were looking to so-called third world countries. They were looking to the East and so-called second world countries. And I think that's important to remember. And I think sometimes some of us scholars are the ones who are imposing that West-East binary, and it wasn't necessarily as strongly there worked for them. And then I want to also pull up the idea from Allison and Esther that teaching is key, because our students have no idea. And when I first started teaching East German art, I used to start with, this is what socialist realism, what we think socialist realism is, and then I would deconstruct it. I realized they had no idea, so I was telling them what they should think at the beginning. Now I bring it in at the end, and they're like, oh, those stupid old people, that's what they think socialist realism is, right? Or like, that's what they think East German art is. And so I think we're in a very powerful position as teachers that we can help mold the minds of the next generation, and they're the ones who are going to take it, and then their students are going to take it further and further and further. And so I really want to emphasize that, and that maybe we can come together and try to create some sort of textbooks and things like that. So thank you.
Thank you, April. And now,
yes. So I just would like not to be polemical, but rather a little bit more precise. That I think that the main question is not that figuring out totally new concept, but rather those to shed light on those concepts which is taken for granted. I will tell some examples that sometimes those Western concept imposed on Eastern situation, and we are struggling to apply them because there is no good fit to it. For example, I just was dealing with public-private division, and it is totally different in Eastern Europe as in Western meaning. Or, let's say, in the second wave of feminism, totally eliminated body. In Eastern Europe, the contrary was the case, where conceptual art has to be dematerialized. Hungarian conceptual art, and especially post-conceptualism, absolutely relies on body. So there is a lot of contradiction. So I think, and it is maybe a bit a subtle work on working on details, and to show that this is not an exact fit, and to show the gaps, where is the differences. And maybe afterwards we can give a name to it, but there is a lot of that kind of controversy. So that is why I told that we need some ear for these gaps and differences, subtle differences, but they truly exist. Or pop art, what is the consumerism in Western countries. We discussed this a lot with Piotrowski, that it is the politics in Eastern Europe. So we cannot rely on consumerism because we did not have that kind of stuff. So these differences, I think, is where the point or the devil is.